And now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll turn from the national perspective to an international perspective, because now we'll have 3 keynote speaks followed by a Q&A session here on stage. And the first speaker is Mr. Alessandro Blasi. He's a special advisor to the International Energy Agency's CEO. He will address how the green transition is progressing into an international perspective and what he sees as the role for oil and gas in the long and the short run. And the title of his presentation is Global Energy Investment and the Need for an Energy Transition. Mr. Blasi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. So, for those that are not familiar, the International Energy Agency is, we love to define as the Global Energy Authority, which represents today about 75% of the world energy consumption, and it looks to all fuels, all technology. So we do not have something that we love more or we love less. We try to look at the energy and climate sector in its entire, and we try to advise policymakers and energy stakeholders in general, companies, about the sustainable future. So I thought to call my presentation is the global energy sector in transition, ? Because it depends very much from which angle you are looking at this. It depends where you are, which sector you are looking at, and also it depends if we are open to accept some bitter truth. So the first point is where we are now. How the energy demand is growing. And let's clarify one thing up front, because if you look at the media, you might have a different perception. Energy is a good thing. Energy is something that empowers our life. Hospitals for the people that need care, give access to the people that don't have. So energy is a good thing. The problem is the emission, not the energy. So this is something to be well shaped into the mind, well set into the mind. So, and if we look energy from a market perspective, it's going very well, with quite decent growth every year. But if we look at 2018, the last year, the demand grows particularly strongly, and I heard before speaking about gas as a fuel for transition. I don't know if it is, but last year, about 46% of the global energy demand growth was covered by gas. So almost half gas, all the other fuel together, the other 50%. The second point is, are we in transition? Well, is a question of the glass is half full or half empty, because, as the chart shows, 70% of the global energy demand growth was met by fossil fuel. I heard before also about the licensing round, which is a hot topic in Denmark, and it's not up to the IEA to say you should do it, you should not do it. What can I say is that some country has oil, some country has gas, some country has wind or other things. There is one thing that each country has, and is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is something extremely important to reach our climate goals, and is the only option that allows to conjugate climate goals, energy security, and the recent events in the Middle East remind us the importance of energy security, and economy benefits, economic gains. But when we look what is happening in terms of energy intensity improvements, which is let's put in this way, the best way to measure nowadays. So how more we become efficient to use the energy per unit of GDP, what we see is that there is a slowdown. And 2018, this slowdown continued. There are a few reasons for this. Is relax of policies in buildings. 1 out of 2 buildings built in the world nowadays has no building codes, no building standards. And in the moment you build up a building, it's going to stay there for 40, 50, 60 years. To renovate it, to make it more efficient, is much more difficult and much more expensive. But also lower oil prices have incentivized less efficient cars, for instance. The purchase of bigger cars. I will be back on this in a moment. So the overall result is that we are speaking of transition. We are having millions of meetings about climate, but the mission do not care about meetings or discussion. The problem is the mission continued to rise, and in 2018 we have reached another historical record, which of course is something not acceptable because put us in a trajectory of +3 degrees increase. And +3 degree increase, just to quote my chief, my executive director, is not to take the jacket off and enjoy warm. It's catastrophic. So this is something extremely important to keep in mind. Now, this is the starting point. And I told you at the beginning, and in my country they say, real friends tell you the bitter truth. So these are data. It's not opinion. These are data. As the IEA, we love to look at the data, at the facts. So one way to try to understand what's happening in this sector is to look at the investment. Because the investment of today are going to materialize in the market in 2, 3, 5, 7 years, according to the sector, and reasonably are set to remain into the market and to determine the trend. So at the IEA, we look at all the investment, sector by sector, fuel by fuel, and what we've seen is the global energy investment budget is about 1.8 trillion, so something less than 2% of the global GDP, and has been stable over the last few years, always around this. When we look sector by sector, there are some worrying news. Number one, investment in renewables outside the power sector are negligible. Renewables in transport and heat are negligible. If you ask to anyone on the street, he will tell you, very likely, because does another job, but very likely you will face the situation that they believe that electricity is equal energy. Electricity is 20% of the global energy consumption. There is another 80% there. And renewables there remains, so far, negligible. Another surprise, investment in coal supply increased. Now, thanks God that this is not to expand the production capacity, but is more to maintain a current level of production. But nonetheless, I think very few would have expected that investment in coal supply increased. Efficiency, unfortunately, for the first time over the last 4 years, stabilized, didn't increase as previously. Oil and gas a bit rebounded, but we are, and this is mainly due to upstream last year, but we are still around $300 billion of investment in upstream, lower than the peak we reached in 2014, which doesn't tell you the entire story because the oil and gas industry has done incredibly good in improving its cost structure over the downturn. But overall amount is still very low. And the last but not least, the power sector declined a bit, but remained ahead of oil and gas. So there are three main takeaways in our view on this. Number one, 2018 investment stabilized, but if you look, those that increased, even if marginally, were fossil fuel supply. Number two, the investment in renewables outside the power sector remains negligible, and this is a critical area that needs to scale up. And number three, the power sector is, for the third year in a row, is ahead of the oil and gas sector. This has never been the case in the history. And this gives a minimum of indication of the direction where the world is going, which is that our economies are electrifying. Digital application, air conditioning, all these kind of things. But when we see this, the second set of questions that we have posed to ourselves is, okay, fine, interesting, we have seen this, but are we investing enough to meet our energy security goals? And are we investing enough to meet our environmental goals? And this, when we look at the overall amount of investment, the answers, plural, is no. Because whatever scenario we consider, the new policy scenario, which is the one that incorporates current policies, and the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is the one that is aligned with the Paris Agreement, we see that the level of investment, total level of investment, is not enough. But when we look at the different sectors, of course, we see that there is a quite a significant, important reallocation of the investment. We need definitely to get rid of coal, especially in the climate scenario. We need a bit of a reallocation between oil and gas, but still we need investment. And to make clear of this again to the public, when you invest in oil and gas, it's not to satisfy growth. The oil and gas fields are like human beings. When they are young, they ramp up. Then you reach the maturity age, so you plateau. And when you are old, you start to decline. It's like this. At least the conventional. Unconventional is a bit faster, but the conventional is like this. So what you need is that you need to invest to replace the production you lose. So investment in the sector do not mean to boost oil and gas consumption more. Even in a scenario where you have oil and gas demand declining, you still need to invest. Of course, less compared to a scenario where oil and gas demand increase, but you still need to invest. And this is just for a physical effect. It's not because IEA or someone else wishes to have this fuel or the other. When we look at the other side of the equation, of course, there is, especially in the climate scenario, the dramatic need to basically increase investment in renewable power, almost double. Nowadays is about 300 billion per year. This has to go to close to 600. But also, let's not forget something that many people tend to forget, which is what I like to call the forgotten giant of the global energy sector, which is transmission and distribution. Many people think, okay, I built the power plant, the job is over. No. you needed to build the transmission and distribution line. It's a huge market. It's more than 300 billion market as well. And it's extremely important and becoming even more important having, thanks God, more renewables, more distributed generation, more source of supply, and so on. So this is the overview and the comparison with the different scenario we have. Now, as I told you before, as the IEA, we like to look at the data and to look at the facts. So, a sub-question of my presentation question is the global power sector decarbonizing? Because, of course, electricity is the one that gets most of the attention when you read the newspaper and so on. Now, as we know, 97 has been 20 years ago, has been the year of Kyoto Protocol, which is more or less the father of any climate agreement. At that time, we had electricity produced 63% by fossil fuel and 37% low carbon sources. Since then, many efforts has been done. And after 20 years, this is the power. It would have been probably much worse if those efforts wouldn't have been done. But this is the number. And why is this? Because renewables have just replaced nuclear. Again, numbers. And it does, as for the licensing round, as for oil, it's not me to say is good nuclear or is bad nuclear. But the number is, today, in the advanced economies, nuclear is the #1 source of low carbon, zero emission source. It's the #1. Data. So, this concept, you can, unfortunately, transpose also to the global primary energy mix, so the entire energy mix. Your wise neighbor, Norway, in 87, so not 97, in 87, there was an important report prepared and developed by Madame Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, which is basically the father of sustainable development. And it was largely based on the concept of reducing the share of fossil fuel in the energy mix. In 87, the share of fossil fuel in energy mix was 81%. And last year, the share of fossil fuel in the energy mix was 81%. In the meantime, energy demand has increased, has skyrocketed. So, what I want to say with this is not that we do not have hope that we cannot change this, but as this is an oil and gas conference, the energy system is like a big tanker. It's not a small boat that can change direction in 1 second or overnight. You need an adjustment. There is an inertia, many things. So it's complicated and requires to be seen in all the different aspects. Now, the power sector is like this globally, but there are also good news, which is not the case in all countries, in all regions. So if we take the region we belong to, European Union, how the things are going to evolve? Coal is going to go down, thanks to the phase-out policies of many countries, including, if I'm not mistaken, Denmark by 2030. Nuclear is set to go down as well, and again, is a matter of phase-out policy. Gas is seen as a form of energy transition, but again, another thing. The #1 driver of gas in the world, the gas demand growth, is not power, is industry, is petrochemicals, is fertilizer, It's not the power sector, it's not electricity. We have other renewables growing and solar making inroads, considering how densely populated is Europe, and some countries might be less blessed by sun compared to others. And wind is set to become the #1 source. And this is a country that has a big leadership in wind, because you have already about 50% of electricity generation from wind, some days 130% of the total, and even more can come with the development of offshore wind, which brings a series of benefits, both in terms of electricity capacity cost, but also I would say in terms of industry, because there are some synergies between those that have developed competencies in working offshore for oil and gas and the development of offshore wind. Now, as I said at the beginning, as the IEA, we look at all technology. We are quite agnostic on this, and we try to track how these technologies are progressing, if any. And basically, we have categorized 45 technologies. We have 7 which we consider on track. Solar PV is one. We have released on Monday our renewables 2019, which is the forecast to 2024. And we see in 5 years 1,200 gigawatts of renewables coming into the picture, of which 60% is solar. Of course, we are speaking globally. 1,200 gigawatts is basically the entire US power capacity today, which would be added by renewables only and largely by solar. Another one that is doing well is electric vehicles. But again, here, we need to put the thing in prospect, because we have done an analysis as a preview of our World Energy Outlook, which will be released in 3 weeks of time. And there is one interesting data which was astonishing, and is, if you take the last 10 years, after the power sector, the source #1 of growth in emission is SUV, the bigger cars. And when you look at the number, we have electric vehicles are at the beginning, give them time. But today you have more or less in the entire world 6 million of electric vehicles on the road. Half of that is China. But you have 6 million. SUV, 200 million. So these are the proportion, just to, to remember the dimension we are speaking on. In the ones that need improvement, there is a mixture of traditional technology. Nuclear is coming back. In many countries, especially outside the advanced economy, China, India, Russia, and so on. But there are second thoughts about nuclear also in places like the US, but also in some specific European countries, while others, legitimately, are deciding to phase out what they have or to not reintroduce anything. And the new technology, older technology, which is, for instance, hydrogen. There is a big momentum for hydrogen, which is still expensive. It can be produced from renewables, but also from traditional sources, especially in connection with CCUS. And this is seen as a promising option to tackle the hard-to-abate sectors. As I said at the beginning, there is not only electricity. We need to tackle emission in industry, in transport, in many different areas. Decarbonizing electricity is important, but you need more than that. And last, there are those that are not on track, are off track. And for instance, on this, we have put fuel economy for the reason of SUV I mentioned. The consumer preference to buy bigger cars with more optional, bigger in dimension, heavier, basically offset the improvement we have in the efficiency of the cars. So the fuel economy of our way to moving deteriorates instead of improving and many others. But I would like to finish with a couple of things which are, I think, important also in terms of something which is very much at the top of the agenda in the media and so on. So what the oil and gas company can do to play a role in the energy transition. It's very easy to attack oil and gas company. It's more difficult to try to think their role, how they contribute, and how to stimulate the company to do better. So there is, of course, as we have seen in certain companies, especially European ones, an increasing attention towards renewable, investing more in electricity, renewable in solar, or in wind offshore, Equinor close by. Others that have completely changed mission, like Ørsted, and so on. But there are also, this company has also a huge technical know-how, competencies, dimension to push into the mix some technologies that can help to make a more sustainable use of the fossil fuel. Number one for us is carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is extremely important, especially if you consider that we have in the world about 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants. 2,000. And 90% of these 2,000 are in the emerging economies, are in China, are in India, are in Indonesia. And here we have two problems. Number one, this country open a new coal-fired power plant to generate the electricity to give access to their people to develop. They do not build a new coal-fired power plant to have the fifth television at home. So it's very difficult to say, no, you shut down. Because in Copenhagen, in Paris, in Brussels, or in Washington, we have decided this. Number two, this 90% fleet is young, is 11 years old on average. And you make your investment with a time frame of 30, 40, 50 years, not 10 years. So it's very difficult retirement. So one thing which is good is that momentum behind the CCUS is growing, with more initiative around the world. Some of them are particularly promising as the policy introduced by US administration, the 45Q, which is giving a boost in order to apply CCUS also in enhanced oil recovery fields and elsewhere. Still, the investment in this technology remains marginal. And this is an area where there could be scope for increasing. A second one is methane leakage. This is a very important area, which is a bit technical, so get more under the radar. But methane emission is very difficult to quantify, is very difficult to track at a global level, but estimates say that the amount of methane emission is not marginal, is not trivial. And you need to address, because methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas that remains in the atmosphere. Here, the good news is that we have the technology to address this. So the companies has to implement this. The cost is marginal. So they have to prove, the companies, some are more in advanced stage, some are in a less advanced stage. They should prove to not be greedy, to implement and to give their contribution. And we have seen a growing attention on methane emission and other areas. For instance, many companies have joined this methane guiding principle, which try exactly to address this, and also with a coalition between companies and service companies. So, to conclude, and I am on time, which is a miracle, the first one is you have a complete disconnection between where we have to go, and I underlined we have to go. I have 2 daughters, one is 8-year-old and one 4, so we also on a personal basis, we have to go. And the real life CO2 trends. You see the people discussing emission goes up. So there is a disconnection. It's a fact, it's not an opinion. Number 2, when we look at the investment, as I said before, is a forward-looking indicator. Those are stabilized in 2018, but it's more as a function of investment in the fossil fuel supply rather than, a big shift. And the interesting trend is that there is a confirmation of power being the #1 sector in terms of attracting investment. Until 3 years ago, it has never been the case. Oil and gas was #1. Now, when we look where we have to go and where the money are going, you see a quite limited shift in the allocation of money. If giving an helicopter overview on the investment, it looks like that they are insufficient in the traditional part of the energy system, the one, let's say, closer to energy security, and at the same time have not accelerated enough for the clean energy transition. And this means that we are storing up a risk for the future. And energy security is something that many of us might have forgotten and giving for granted energy access and so on, but we have seen recently more and more geopolitics coming into the picture and reminding us that we have really to keep a focus on energy security. We believe that among all technologies that has a big potential, offshore wind is definitely placed very well. Before it just came to my mind listening before the debate, because the North Sea, and I think the North Sea is giving to this region 2 Eldorado. The first one has been the oil and gas Eldorado of the 80s. The second Eldorado can be offshore wind. The potential is huge. There are challenges to be overtaken, but it's a big opportunity. And for this, I'm not, of course, going any details because I have my executive director coming here on tomorrow evening to launch this new global report of offshore wind in Copenhagen with the energy minister. And last but not least is repeat what I told at the beginning. The IEA is all fuels, all technologies. We have the luxury to not have to defend anyone and to try to look in an agnostic way in order to provide the solutions that are, let's say, aligned with your, in terms of country or in terms of stakeholder, economic goals, environmental goals, and security goals. Merci.